All right, I want to begin by explaining something that's in the initial part of the chapter that we had for this week related to the methodology section, and that is on page 70 of the 170, page 170 of the chapter in the newest edition. The author mentions the RFP, and on Canvas I put a list, a vocabulary list, like a kind of key. Grant writing kind of has its own vocabulary at times, and it's helpful to know some of these terms. And RFP is a common term that gets used in the grant world. Today, actually, the one that I'm seeing more and more often is NOFO. Now, RFP is request for proposals. NOFO is notice of funding opportunity. These are both basically the same thing. When grant agencies want to put out a call for proposals, they issue one of these, and they basically become the guidelines or the specific criteria for the grant proposal that you're going to write. So there's something that grant writers use that they follow methodically. And to help better understand what the author's talking about on the first few pages in terms of missing out on a funding opportunity because they didn't align with the RFP, well, I'll give you a short story that I've heard repeated a number of times in the grant world. And that is, in the 1980s, there was this rock band that was popular at the time, called Van Halen. And they would travel to, they would do big giant stadium tours, where they would travel from, city to city to play in these major stadiums. And in their rider, which is this booklet that they would send out ahead of time to these venues, with all their kind of expectations and things for like the lighting and the pyrotechnics and all these things, they had a request in their green room for a bowl of M&Ms with all the blue M&Ms or whatever it was removed from the bowl, which can seem obviously very arbitrary and kind of insignificant. But at least the mentality of the band and their crew was that if the venue had followed this, if they walked into the green room and saw this bowl with all the blue M&Ms removed from it, then they knew that the venue had followed all of the was an indication to the band about the way the venue sort of treated the requirements for the more serious things that were safety issues, like the lighting, the rigging, the pyrotechnics, all those kinds of things. And in the grant world, basically, things like in the RFP or the guidelines, the foundation guidelines, the type of font you're going to use, the margins, the page numbers are really non-negotiable in the eyes of the funder. And they look at the way you handle the proposal as a way that you handle the project. And so there's a lot of famous incidents of major organizations being rejected from funding opportunities for, minor infractions, a slightly off, fraction of an inch off on the margins, or using the wrong type of font, or like headings that are not compliant with the font size, all those types of things. And when I worked for the Department of Education, reviewing grants, and before I'd been in Washington and worked with the Department of Ed, the people who worked there would tell me stories about senators and congressional representatives coming over angry about organizations in their district that had missed out on major funding opportunities for really minor infractions. But essentially that's just the way the grant world operates. So obviously for this class, like, I'm not going to fail a student for not having the right type of font or something, but I will say that I do notice it, and I do try to make note of it, because it is really important to follow those guidelines. And along with that, beyond the font and the sizing and the spacing and those types of things, in the methodology section, addressing the concerns of the funder and addressing all the criteria of the RFP is really essential. And that's I think the story and the message that the author is trying to get to in the beginning of the chapter for this week. So the other things I wanted to say, and I think that methodology it's a pretty broad scope, and you do have more space allotted to it. So according to the foundation guidelines that we're using for this course, Most of the sections are reduced to 2 pages. Methodology is 3 pages, and sustainability limited to 1 page, if I remember correctly. So you do get a little more room in methodology, and it's very important to use that space to really address all of the elements that the funder would look for. And I think the 2 biggest things are, you want to convey capacity, and that is a sense that the person who receives the grant is going to be able to manage and run the grant effectively. So that can include things like talking about your nonprofit, how long you've been in existence, noting that you have a board of a board of trustees or a board of directors, or someone who oversees your nonprofit, that you have managed grants successfully in the past, or that you have the mechanisms in place to handle the funding, that you have 501(c) status, all those types of things that a reviewer might look at and be worried about. You want to make sure you address in the methodology section. The other thing to do, that just as a quick side note that's mentioned in the chapter, is to address any potential reservations or concerns that the funder or granting agency might have. So to give you an example of this, in a grant that I just submitted in April, we included a section talking about, it was for an international project, and talking about the coronavirus and how we would handle travel restrictions and different factors if those kinds of restrictions remain in place in the spring. So it was addressing those concerns that the funder might have. And then generally there are some stock statements that are included about, if there was an emergency or something would happen. In a lot of our international plans, we include security plans, experiences dealing with prior issues that have arisen, things like that. So you want to try to quell any of the fears or apprehensions that the funder may have. Some of the things that can be included to help in the section are graphics. So for example, like a management structure. So you could do this either for the nonprofit that you have, who is the director, who do they report to. For example, if you were working within the structure of Ball State, there's usually a clear organizational hierarchy that goes through, like, it might go through a dean, it might go to the provost, then to the president. So it goes up a kind of hierarchy, and there's a structure in place. And sometimes it's helpful for the funder to know that structure. That could exist for the nonprofit. But you could also develop that structure for the grant, the way in which staff of the grant, or if you have mentors, maybe they report to certain project staff, then that project staff reports to the project director. So it's sort of laying out those dynamics. It's one of the reasons grant writing gets easier over time, because once you've developed those, maybe the history of the organization, the structure of the nonprofit, those things, those graphics, you have those and you can easily plug them into future grants, and that makes it a lot easier. Or just alter it for the grant that you're writing. But you want to include those. The other thing is that in this section, I know I encouraged you to include activities, timelines for your goals and objectives. What you might do in this section is leave those in the goals and objectives sections. You can always reference other sections, noting that you included those activities for your goals and objectives. But let's say you have a mentor program and your goals and objectives are all situated around recruiting your participants, your training for the mentors. It's all over that structure. Well, there's likely other things that you haven't maybe talked about yet, like the space. Where are your mentors going to meet with the mentees? Where is your project director going to be located? Where are you going to hold meetings? Those kinds of things can all be hashed out as activities and sort of formatted in the methodology section. So anything that you haven't covered already that would help, again, give the funder a better understanding of how the actual nuts and bolts and logistics of the project are going to work, you would want to include in that section. You can develop, your way of envisioning a timeline for the project. One way I've done this in the past is, I look at the pre-program phase, which can be the planning and development, the actual implementation phase, and then the post-program phase, which would include like the evaluation, data collection, things like that. Things that you'll talk about more in the evaluation section, but things that you can kind of set up a little bit in the methodology section. I think that's basically primarily what I wanted to get to. Trying to think just to make sure if there's anything else. If I do, I will include those in notes in an email and try to think about them. I do think the chapter gives you a good outline and set of examples for some of those things. And again, another thing you can include would be, that's included in the chapter, things like position descriptions. If you are still trying to, let's say like you're recruiting mentors for your program, you would want to include like the criteria that you would have. Oh yeah, and I do remember one other thing. Earlier I mentioned that your needs assessment should help set up your goals and objectives and other parts of the grant. And so that's in the methodology section is where you can speak to some of those things. So if you wanted to recruit, let's say you're developing a piece of information for families in poverty in Madison County. Well, in your needs section, you noted that, that county is your target area, and there are 6,000 families of need living below the poverty line in that county. In your methodology section, you would want to draw the logical link. You would want to say, like, as I noted in my needs section, there are 6,000 families living below the poverty line. Subsequently, we have planned for, 6,000 booklets or whatever it is you're producing. Or let's say you're doing a mentor program for African American males in Muncie. Well, you've used the Department of Ed data to note that there are so many students, African American students, in Muncie Community Schools, and then you would say in the needs section, as noted, there are 300 African American students. There, data indicates that 30% of the families, or 40% of the families or students in Muncie are eligible for free and reduced lunch. Subsequently, we are targeting this number of students. We're going to try to recruit from this pool of students. So we think it's reasonable that we end up with, 30, 40, whatever it is, students that we're targeting. So there's a logical link that helps the reviewer know, okay, this person has thought through and what they're proposing based on the information I've provided seems feasible. So it should sort of the methodology should make things come together and make sense. And again, really try to anticipate what questions, concerns, issues the reviewer might have, and try to address those. So hope this is helpful, and I'll try to add more by email.